Hi guys, welcome to our recovery session. This is day one of activity, and honestly, again, just as usual with these activity days, just try to join in as much as possible, even if you don't have the same equipment. Just do your best to mimic what we're doing, or just realize that with these videos you can kind of save it for another day if you don't have the right equipment and revisit it, because it's just so important that not only do we understand the principles and the science and the rationale behind why we might be doing something, super important that we get hands-on and we experience it as we are best able to do. And that just gives us that perspective so that when we're coaching others, we can explain a little bit better. If they're struggling with it, we can say, oh yeah, I wasn't feeling it and then I did this. Okay, so now we can try that, sort of something like that. So just be sure that you are basically getting your hands dirty with this stuff as much as possible. And especially since now that we're on recovery days, this is the feel-good stuff. So you definitely don't want to miss out on this stuff. It's good stuff. I want to start with talking about some pros and cons of not necessarily recovery work, but what you might do for a cool down, because those cool downs, the goal is to basically get your recovery work kick-started right away. And if you can find an appropriate time or appropriate bout of activity to do in a cool down, whether it's active recovery or passive recovery, if you can find something appropriate that fits your goals and kind of suits the needs of your population, your clients, or your athletes, absolutely go for it, and maybe even prioritize it. That could easily be what separates you from your competition. Or if you're talking to an individual who's kind of burning the candle at both ends, they feel like their sleep is good, their diet's good, their training is great, maybe start talking to them a little bit about their cool downs after a hard training session, or maybe their overall recovery, kind of those little things that fill in the gaps. So this kind of gives us a competitive advantage, and kind of like Al Pacino says in the movie Any Given Sunday, this helps us gain some of those extra inches. So this is not, to go from doing no cool downs to implementing cool downs, probably not going to, boost anybody's lifts by 50%, or cut their sprint times in half, but it helps us stay a little bit healthier, feel a little bit better, be a little bit more motivated for that upcoming training session. And those little sort of inches start to accumulate, and before long you're making a big difference. And that's where really the recovery work comes into play, as well as maybe utilizing it in a cool down. So let's prioritize it a little bit more than maybe we have in the past. That's probably everybody likes to go and lift heavy weights, and some people might even take their diet seriously. But I would say that recovery work is probably sort of like the last item on the checklist for what serious athletes are or are not doing. So if you want to get better, if you want to help others get better, maybe start rethinking your recovery work. Now, some things that we may not want to do right away in a cool down after a lift, there's some science that both supports ice baths as well as basically shows them to be non-beneficial. So I would say if I'm a strength athlete or a bodybuilder, if I'm looking for hypertrophy and if I'm looking for muscular development, I'm probably not going to do any cold therapy immediately following a training session. So when those muscles are pumped up with blood and they've been traumatized and they've been irritated, it's some of that trauma and that irritation that sort of sends out like a call. It's like a smoke signal that calls to the body out for hormones and for healing properties. So maybe look up prostaglandins. So having some hormones come into your localized tissue and actually cause some swelling and cause some damage, cause some swelling and cause some discomfort, may actually lead to growth and getting the adaptation that we're looking for. So sometimes a really aggressive recovery protocol immediately following a hard training session is a good idea, and sometimes it's not, because sometimes we want our body to actually be a little bit traumatized by the stress, because then when we properly adapt to it, we see our gains and our results. And what are some, I wanted to kind of rant about a little bit about some easy and doable recovery methods that you could do at any gym, or maybe if you're out at a park running around. Basically, it doesn't require like a super expensive like cryotherapy chamber or an orchestrated cold tub or a masseuse, but just what are things that we can do sort of anywhere. And really, right off the top of my head, I would say that utilizing breathing patterns. We talked a little bit about that already in this program. If you go back to our lecture on our core, as well as our core activity day, in our core activity days, we were talking about the importance of breathing, and we already spoke a little bit about some mechanics. I'll do a quick refresher today, just because I think it's that important. And again, this isn't something that was even on my radar a handful of years ago, and now I talk about it probably a little bit too much on a regular basis. So it's scientifically backed, it's weird, it's easy, it works. So that's kind of why I talk about it. So breathing we can do anywhere. Active recovery, like a little bit of a cool down jog. So instead of doing a hard training session and then jumping in your car and driving for 15 or 20 minutes to get home, which is sort of a terrible idea, because you're heating up all the tissues and then you're sitting in a terrible posture for a little while, and that's going to make your hip flexors tighten up and things like that. So beware of sort of just plopping down and sitting immediately following some training or competition. But just doing some cool down work. So if you go out running at a park or hiking around or running sprints or whatever it is, go that extra mile, and maybe not an actual mile, but spend another 5 or 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be a jog or a run. It could just be a walk, but what you're going to do there is you're going to promote blood flow, which blood flow is kind of a big deal when it comes to recovery. It's sort of the secret sauce. And if you look back to our lecture day that we just did, think about like my usher handout, where we're talking about ushering blood. So at the end of that activity day, it could be a jog, it could be a little bit of a walk, but just some sort of extra activity to boost blood flow and also let that body cool down naturally. So maybe not going from a super hard workout and maybe having like a finisher at the end of the workout, which might be like prowler sprints or a maximal bench press or maximal push-up test or something like that really revs you up high, and then going from that to like zero. Taking that time to do some more blood flow circulation and to actually let that body temperature drop and let your heart rate come down a little bit more naturally, instead of going from really aggressive, intense activity and then down into sitting in your car and listening to Backstreet Boys. Not that any of us might do that. So we've got breathing, we have simple cool downs, and then just simple stretches and body work and care. And those are some of the things that we'll go over today. And so just by incorporating, if you go from 0 minutes of cool down and 0 minutes of recovery work to maybe 5 minutes a day, that's going to start giving you that little advantage that's going to build up over time, and eventually you'll have that compound interest that will make a big difference over time, especially if you're a younger athlete. And most young athletes, I would say basically 21, 22 and under athletes tend not to even feel the need to really warm up or cool down. They're young enough that they regenerate and they just kind of feel good all the time. But when you start, maybe you are getting to be about 22 years old and you've been playing college sports for 4, maybe 5 years, you'll notice that the body starts to age a little bit. So for me and from a lot of individuals I talk to, it's like warming up and cooling down and taking care of yourself was like for sissies until you get to be like 25, 27, and you want to keep training, and all of a sudden your body's telling you that that's not really an option. So it becomes important sooner or later. And so my advice to everybody is, even if you're feeling good, just kind of sprinkle in some TLC and some self-care in the form of a brief recovery at the end of a lift, or a small recovery session outside of your big lifts. So we're going to kind of dive back into it. I'm going to revisit that breath work just because that's so darn important. It's something we might have heard before, even in this program, but just going to revisit it briefly and kind of give some coaching cues and a little bit of a reminder on the science of it. Because we can do this anytime. We can do this at the end of a lift. We can do this within like a little meditation or mindfulness session, or you can just do it to try to help yourself go to sleep. So this is breathing for the purpose of driving your parasympathetic nervous system, for calming the body down. And also it's going to activate the proper breathing muscles that we're born with. Again, if you've ever held an infant or seen basically a baby breathe in and out, they create like a big old pot belly, and then they create a six-pack, and they go from pot belly to six-pack. And that's where all the good breathing action occurs. And we're born doing that. That's how we're wired. It's when we become stressed and we start living in the modern society, and we're texting and we're driving and we're doing extra push-ups, because you can do push-ups anywhere, and we're doing extra homework and we're sitting at the computer and all this other stuff. That's when we starting to breathe up into our chest with our pec minor, our traps, sternocleidomastoid, instead of down in the diaphragm with the obliques, serratus anterior, all this good stuff that's supposed to be down here, transverse abdominis, supposed to be activated and involved in your breathing patterns. And it, sort of ironically, is also involved in core bracing, and which comes in handy if we're lifting heavy weights or if we're performing explosive and dynamic athletic movements. So, call me crazy, but getting your breathing pattern from going up in here to down here, where it's actually going to serve a purpose in growing your core strength and stabilizing your spine and driving your parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, that's just kind of like a win-win-win situation in my eyes. So just some quick reminders. Oof, I was half kneeling for longer than I thought it would be. Just a quick reminder, I want to get up on the camera here. The average individual, when they take a big breath, is coming into that chest there. We're not really interested in that. That doesn't do us very much good. In fact, what we're really interested in is a breath in through the nose to fill up our pot belly, and that air might leave through the nose or the mouth. So that's our mechanics. Not necessarily our timing, but that is our mechanics. And you can practice this sitting, standing, laying on your side, laying on your belly, on your back, or whatever. But when I'm coaching it, one of the easiest ways I find to coach is to have individuals just lay down on their back. And the nice thing about this is you can just lay a big group down and line them all up, and you can kind of go to the end of the line and look for that individual who might be chest breathing more than belly breathing. And if you guys want to hop down right now and kind of assume the position, or maybe go back and forth between watching the video and perform this yourself, go for it. But I'm going to kind of fall into my coaching mode while I'm sort of in my doing mode. But I'm going to encourage individuals to put one hand over their sternum or chest and one hand over their navel or belly button. And the reason we want one hand on each, let's say left hand on chest, right hand on belly button. And now we know where that air is going, because when we have faulty breathing patterns, we might think that we're breathing into our belly, but once we put our hands up there, it's really going to give us a little bit more feedback and help get us lined up. And let's try to find ourselves taking a breath in for about 4 seconds and then breathing out for about 4 seconds. And there might be a small pause in between the inhale and the exhale. That's okay. It'll come with time. And if you find that chest starts to rise, don't sweat it, Hakuna Matata. But if that chest is rising, I would advise sort of aborting that current breath that you're on, exhaling it out, taking a couple of smaller belly breaths, sort of like teeny little sure thing breaths down in the belly. And after a couple of those smaller breaths, try another larger 4-second inhale. And I've seen big crowds of teams fall into position on the ground here, and basically everybody gets it on the first try, no problem. And I've also seen the opposite of that, where there is the majority of a group, their first few breaths are really chest driven, and it's basically like it's like a total slap to their ego, because they see like old Coach Mitch doing some belly breaths, and then they're like this young stud athlete and they can't even figure it out. So if I can do it, that's a pretty good indicator that pretty much anybody else can do it as well. So sometimes people will really struggle to get that belly breath going, that chest will keep rising. But honestly, 30 seconds to a minute of a little bit of practice here, and they can usually kind of find their stroke a little bit. And the more they struggle in the beginning immediately, it probably means that a little bit of practice isn't going to solve the problem. It probably means that, 3 minutes later, when they're walking around, they've fallen back into their old ways. But that's why you have to incorporate this regularly and coach them up and remind them to do it on their own. Because what you're doing is you're correcting a pattern, and you got to think, if they're taking X number of breaths per day, and they're taking them all sort of in the wrong pattern, and then you give them 2 minutes of focused work 3 times a week, that's probably not really going to make a dent in it. But if you get them to remind them on a regular basis, if you maybe talk them into like incorporating it at practice, or when they're at the office, or when they're driving in traffic, or when they're trying to go to sleep, then you're going to start to make a little bit more impact. So for me, that's one of the easiest ways that I will coach them up and get them involved there. You can also do basically that same breathing pattern for that alligator breathing. And your forehead might be on your forearms, or it might just be on your fingertips on the ground. And you're just coaching out very similarly, looking for belly breaths, but really when you're laying on the stomach, you might coach them to actually breathe into their lower back a little bit more. So that one's just a little bit easier because honestly, there's so much pressure from the weight of your upper body on that chest that it's not really conducive with chest breathing. So for me, and that might just be in my mind, but for me and what I've seen, when I roll somebody on their belly and I tell them to breathe into their lower back, it clicks pretty quickly. Not that the other way is bad, but they're just both a little bit different. And if someone's having lower back pain, I like that sort of alligator breathing a little bit more, just because I'm getting repetitions of decompression on that spine. So I've personally felt and seen other individuals sort of enjoy that and benefit from it. And then if we're going to incorporate this in sort of just that end of the lift workout, let's say whether it was a training day out on the field or on the court, or if it was a lifting day, one thing we can do that basically everybody appreciates and enjoys is to just elevate the feet. So I don't have a perfect wall setup right here, but I know that even laying right here, I can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. When I elevate those legs, I'm going to get a little bit of that blood coming down as the higher they are above the heart. That makes it a little bit easier for that fluid to drain, whether it's lymph or blood or whatever. But my legs are just, once you put them up, this is something that happens so rarely in a normal day-to-day life that individuals are going to appreciate it, especially if they just work their tail off and they're running around and squatting and doing all this other stuff. When you lift those legs up, the muscles actually get to relax, and you're going to decrease your cardiac output, and that really makes it easy for the heart rate to kind of drop down to the basement. And you can practice your breathing right here. So I'm going to imagine, or I'm going to give you all the chance to reassume the position. And maybe your feet are up on the wall. But here's kind of how I would coach a 1 or 2 minute or 5 minute cool down at the end of a lift. I'd say, all right, everybody, we're down, butt near the wall, legs up, get comfortable. Those legs don't have to be perfectly vertical, just get comfortable. I'd say let's all kind of quiet down a little bit here. Let's go left hand on the chest, right hand over the belly, and we're breathing in through the nose and exhaling out as we please. Take your time. If you feel a big chest rise, don't worry about it. Just exhale that breath, take a couple of small belly breaths, and then try to work your way back into larger 4-second inhales and 4-second out exhales. And the reason this works, guys, is that we've got a nerve called a vagus nerve. It sounds like Las Vegas, but it's way more boring, and it's spelled different as well. So it's V-A-G-U-S, the vagus nerve. That vagus nerve goes down from your brain, it skips the spinal cord, and it goes down into your torso. And it kind of looks like a basketball net kind of draped around your lungs. So when we change our breathing pattern and we breathe down into our belly, which by the way is the way we're supposed to breathe, we start to kind of put some pressure on that vagus nerve. We stimulate that vagus nerve. And that vagus nerve stimulation, in return, what it does for us is it helps our bodies calm down. It tells our bodies that everything's okay. It takes us out of that fight or flight syndrome, which was just happening during our prowler push races or our push-up competition or whatever it was. And it helps us just relax. It tells the body that we're done working crazy hard for the day, and it's okay to just let some muscle tension go away. And it's okay for the heart rate to drop. We don't have to be on high alert anymore. And if you feel like you've got the breathing pattern down, where you're going 4 seconds in with a small break and then 4 seconds out, my next challenge for you is to lengthen that exhale. So for the next several breaths, try to go with 4 seconds in and 6 seconds exhale. And if that's working well for you, try working your way up to an 8-second exhale. And we're always breathing down into the belly, in through the nose, out through the mouth or nose. But we want to expand the waistline on our shorts and just feel that belly filling up with air. So fill up your pot belly. And then as you exhale, pull that belly button back down to the floor and kind of flex your six-pack a little bit. And I'm going to let you guys stay calm and quiet and just focus on our bodies, feel ourselves breathing, feel our heart rates lowering. Now we're going to stay put for 1 more minute. And for our purposes, I'm not going to wait for 1 more minute because we've got work to do. But if I'm coaching up a group, that's just an easy thing you can do anywhere. You find a fence or a wall or a row of bleachers outside, whatever it is, and you go from kicking athletes' butts to being nice to them like that, and putting a little bit of science behind it. All this breathing stuff was sort of hippy-dippy, crunchy, yoga-esque, whatever it was, but now it's got all the science behind it, and it's proven, and there's great reasons to do it. So if you can kind of tie all that together, more power to you. From there, let's talk about joint distractions. So while we're running around and maybe checking people or lifting weights or whatever it is, our joints start to accrue a little bit of stress, and they might become misaligned. They might have little micro tears in them. And if we can be nice to our joints, that sounds like a pretty smart idea, right? Help us last a little bit longer through the season, maybe keep our careers going a couple extra years, or just to feel better. It seems like everybody's kind of got like that one achy shoulder or that one kind of trick knee or whatever it is. And some of us have several of those joints. So a little bit of self-care, especially with this joint distractions. And you might call it a subluxation, which is sort of like a partial dislocation. You might call it a dislocation, but it's not actually like the goal is not to take your joint out of neutral position, at least not detrimentally. The goal is just to do a little bit of mobility work in just a really easy way, and to help undo some of the stress that might be going on in that joint. So I'm going to go through a few joints here, and if any of this is appealing, you should really check out Dr. Kelly Starrett. Some amongst the books that he's written, two are Supple Leopard and Desk Bound. I guess it's Becoming a Supple Leopard. But Kelly Starrett, he's a doctor of physical therapy who knows his stuff. He's put out so much information on the interwebs, on the YouTubes, and also he's written books, and he's really popular. But I kind of dig a lot of stuff that he puts out, and putting it into practice on myself and my athletes, it has paid off. So I would encourage anybody who is interested in that space or wants to learn more. Those books are both great resources, as well as just Google a guy, check out YouTube. He's going to have all kinds of resources for you. He's been pumping out YouTube videos for like the last decade or something. So, but anyways, so this shoulder distraction movement, I first picked up the shoulder distraction movement when I was working with the University of Missouri football team in 2012. And it's just something that it just makes so much sense. It's just such a, it's just a really simple movement. It's kind of idiot proof. You can give them a few examples, and then you basically just tell them to do what feels good in and around that. So if I've maybe just finished like a bench press day, or if I've got an athlete who's upper body dominant, like a lineman, a track and field thrower, this is a pretty good one that basically it's going to get you like oohs and ahs from the crowd, and you're going to make some friends by putting this into your program. And again, this would go in at the end of the day on an upper body lift, or basically any old time, because again, most people are not doing these kinds of things. So to implement this, basically makes them feel good and makes you a popular individual. So with that shoulder distractions, there's a couple ways to go about it, but basically I'm just going to slide my hand into that band there, and I'll wind it up a couple of times so that it's going to hug my wrist just a little bit extra. And I have my hand over the top. You don't want to be gripping that too tight, because that's going to kind of defeat the purpose. You want relaxation, and you want that joint to be comfortable enough or relaxed enough to do a little bit of a partial dislocation or a subluxation, or a distraction. I call them distractions, so whatever you want to call them. But I would say 3 key positions there. One is I'm going to turn away. See if I can get you guys a better. I'm going to turn away. So if I've got an athlete who has just done some heavy pressing, and they've maybe really activated the pec and the delt, coming right here is going to feel awesome. And I did some pressing like 5 hours ago, and it still feels good. It probably doesn't matter that I pressed today, but it just still feels good because so many of us need this and we're not doing this on a regular basis. Now, if I know that I want to change the length of tissue, if I'm actually working on flexibility, I'm gonna put like a 2-minute minimum on a hold of a stretch. But if I'm just coming in here for recovery work and I want to feel a little bit better, I'm probably gonna say more like around 30 seconds per position. So right here, I'm not quite distracting that joint yet. This is more of just a stretch along like the anterior muscles there, pec, delt, my biceps getting a decent little stretch in there. So that's position 1. For position 2, I'm gonna come across. I've got that arm kind of up in my chest here, and I'm getting something on my rear delt there that is just a super unique stretch, and honestly, it feels great. And if I want, I can do a little bit of a power assist right there. And if you guys are at home or at a gym that doesn't have a strap like this, you can grab a cable, you can grab a different kind of band. Honestly, if you're like near a squat rack, you could probably do a really similar thing just by holding on to like the column of a squat rack. And again, about 30 seconds. And my third one is going to be just to sit back here, and that joint is going to have a good distraction there. And honestly, if I kind of like arch into it just a little bit, I get a really unique lat stretch there. It feels good, and this is a lot of times this is like a crowd favorite, just because they sort of get to sit down at the same time and they're getting such a unique stretch. And what's happening in that joint there, with that distraction, with that decompression, we are promoting and encouraging a little bit of additional fluid exchange. We're making room, and we're creating a little hair of a vacuum for fluid to come in and speed up any healing process, but also to lubricate that joint a little bit extra. So we're setting ourselves up for success in that joint. On top of it feeling good and helping muscles stretch out, but that's a very boiled down version of what's going on in the joint. And I want to do the other side, but just to save time, I won't. So I'll do that later on my own time. But those are both pretty easy. I'll just jump right back in real quick and just point out that if you wanted to do an active version of it, you could get in a really similar position, and I've seen and experimented with basically some small contractions there. And I like it. I like the idea that as I'm contracting there, I'm going to contract and relax and maybe get a little bit further of a stretch each time. So that's another good option there. So there's our shoulder. Think about those joints that we want to mobilize the most on a regular basis. So we got our shoulder taken care of. How about our hip? I feel like I never knew or worked with anybody who had hip issues until probably 6 or 7 years ago, and now I feel like I've always got one client or one athlete running around that's either fighting hip issues or is recovering from a hip surgery. So I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just one of those things that kind of just came in a wave in my own personal life, or I don't know what the deal is. But anyway, so that shoulder joint and that hip joint, both similar, real similar joints, ball and socket joints. So we are able to encourage and promote some movement in there, some positive distraction. Again, kind of hoping to encourage some recovery work there. So just kind of hiking that band up high into the groin, and then you have about 1 million variations of movements that you can do there. So a pretty easy one that I like is actually pairing the band resistance with a pigeon stretch. Now I'm going to get a little bit of space there, and I'm going to sit into it. And that is just going to kind of supercharge that pigeon stretch. And really what I'm doing is I'm getting a little bit of distraction of that femoral head laterally towards where the band is pulling from. and it's just a unique feel, and you can kind of tell that something's different going on in there. And I have struggled with hip labral issues myself. And I probably haven't mentioned this yet, but with all this mobility work, not really appropriate to do on hypermobile individuals. So when there is like some obvious tears, or not obvious, but suspected tears, or some hypermobility, that may not be the time to do this. That may be the time to do more stability work and to let that joint actually settle a little bit. So this is preventative in nature, and not so much a cure-all. So keep in mind that if an individual is hypermobile, that may be a reason to maybe find a different route of care for them. And again, so we can do this hip joint from a few different angles here. So just doing a half kneeling hip flexor stretch. Again, I'm just supercharging this stretch. That I can feel that hip flexor getting a little something extra, because that femoral head inside of that joint is getting pulled forward in a unique way that, like a normal glute squeeze with no band here, isn't going to quite give me the same stretch that I'm getting right now. And the third one that I like, it's going to be right there. Again, just facing away, finding different angles. There are just so many options on this. Again, Kelly Starrett is going to have like a Rolodex of options for us. And really, the first thing I would do is encourage you all to just slide your leg in and start playing around and find some spots that feel good and hang out for a little bit. And you can do same thing on the ankle. You're not going to have quite as many angles to play with. You basically just want that. For me, I'm typically just going to want to, for a healthy ankle, I'm typically just going to want to have that band back behind me. And if I do some of my mobility work, maybe my ankle three-ways, again, with from that band, I'm employing just a brand new variation of the stretch, in which I'm benefiting greatly from just that band and the additional stretch that I'm getting. It's changing the angle, and again, I'm getting that distraction benefit. So joint distractions, sort of something unusual that we're not doing on a regular basis, but something that can be done anywhere. So like those shoulder activities, if you didn't have bands, if you're out on the field, you could have teammates kind of clasp hands, and they can just sit back from each other. And same thing, they can go elbow in hand to elbow in hand, and they can face away from each other, and they can grab hands, or they can grab wrists and face away from each other. So you don't even need a band. You can just do those things anywhere. Let's see here. A huge topic that should be a lot of time should be spent on it, but we're not going to, because that's not really the nature of this program, would be diet. So to check a couple of boxes really quick: having athletes be hydrated, having eaten enough food, and from what I have seen and experienced with like fasted cardio, or like training in the morning with no food in the stomach, some people do it just fine and dandy and they feel great, and other people hit the wall. If possible, I would encourage most athletes to be taking in a little something before a morning training session. It doesn't have to be like a half dozen eggs and a PB&J, But at the on the low end, maybe it's like a half of a PB&J, or some crackers and peanut butter, some crackers and cheese, just something to kind of fuel the fire a little bit while you're going. And remember, it's performance versus aesthetics. So if someone is experimenting or highly focused on fat loss, maybe that's something they want to experiment with. But from what I've seen and experienced, and what I can logically rationalize from a scientific standpoint, I would encourage that individuals are not only eating properly overall, but fueling a little bit ahead of time. So that's probably one of the biggest bugaboos that I see. But getting enough calories throughout the day to train again the next day, for a lot of athletes, that's not a problem. For some, it is. And then keep in mind that with nutrition, be looking at the density of foods. So some foods are more nutrient dense, and some foods are more calorically dense. So if you look at a can of soda, it's not a diet soda or whatever, it's probably going to be calorically dense. Maybe 150 or 200 calories in there, whereas a handful of blueberries, not going to have a whole bunch of, or I guess a handful of spinach, not really going to have any calories in a handful of spinach, but you're going to have a whole bunch of nutrients. You have fiber, vitamin K, vitamin A, a bunch of other things that I'm not thinking of right now. So chlorophyll. So you're going to have some good stuff in there. So think about calorically dense versus nutrient density. And we want to make sure that we're eating nutrient dense foods. And if you need more calories, in a perfect world, you'd be eating a lot of nutrient dense foods. But sometimes you just need calories. And so looking to something like a white rice or a potato, cooked in a healthy fashion. So I'll just stop myself there, because I'll go on a bunch of tangents, and this video will go on forever. And then, so just making sure that your nutrition is on point, that you're getting enough calories. Once you know you're getting enough calories, try to get the right types of calories. And once you're getting the right types of calories, our macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And once you're getting enough the right carbohydrates, then you'd hopefully have them from the right sources. So I got a little bit ahead of myself, but just focus on getting enough food. And once you've got enough food, polish it up and make it a better format of what kind of food you're getting. And then when it comes to recovery, your magic pill is sleep. We should be getting 7 to 9 hours a night for regular humans. If you are a competitive athlete or training more than average, you want to kick that up. Just like if we go for a long run one day, we might need extra calories in our daily intake to offset that. And that same day that we went for a long run, or had a big long lift, or played in a tournament that weekend, just like we might need extra food, we also might need extra sleep, because with extra damage, you want to do a comparable amount of recovery work. Speaking of, here's my last comment. We're like 1 minute away from being done. Speaking of maybe playing in a tournament, or I think about CrossFit athletes who compete, and they might have multiple lifting sessions in a given day. So that's when a cool down might look more like a full-on recovery session. So I think I skipped over that earlier, but for a normal training session where you want the body to be stressed and then to adapt to that stress, I talked earlier about how we may not necessarily want to jump into an ice bath or a contrast shower or a cryo-freeze chamber or whatever it is. But if you have to play another game in several hours, or if you just finished a night game and you've got a morning game coming up, or if you're maybe like a CrossFit competitor and you've basically just wrapped up one lift and you've got another lift in a few hours, that would be sort of a different time, is where you are in survival mode and you're not necessarily looking to benefit from the stress you just went through. Your biggest focus would be more on preparing for the upcoming stress that you're about to face. So I think that was probably something I skipped over earlier, and now I can be done. And so are you. I will see you guys on recovery day 2.